Have you ever taken the time to think about the fact that the only thing that prevents your mind from expanding are your own limited thoughts and or beliefs? I was just reading this book the other day called Seth Speaks, and there's a section in the book where they're talking about mental, psychological barriers that we create ourselves because of whatever reason. At some point in time, those barriers or those things created safety for us. Now, this happens on a daily basis, and in some ways you can even consider like morals and ethics to be these psychological barriers that we agree upon that keep us safe. And what happens is when we have a bunch of these things, even though they've helped in our survival or even though they've helped to maintain us in a society, they also pose limitations and restrictions to what can be expansion for us as individuals. And expansion can go both ways. So you can expand into further understanding of something, or you can even expand further into the darkness of something. And I see it kind of like a spectrum. Like, what do you allow your mind to expand into? And so what I was thinking about when I was reading this the other day in my book, and I found it interesting, was just the ways in which we limit ourselves on a daily basis. And like a very I guess relatable and straightforward sort of analogy to use in something like this is like, for example, religion, right? If you grow up Christian, let's say, like I was raised Christian, then you're set to grow up with a certain set of beliefs that you can't, worship a certain way, you can't speak a certain way, you can't do blasphemy, different rules and regulations. And this is like across all types of things, but I'm just using religion as an example. Now, when you get to a point in your life where you find yourself questioning or getting to a point where you reach that boundary, whatever that boundary is, right? Let's say that boundary is that you're never supposed to explore another religion. This is all hypothetical, by the way. I'm just using this as an example. But let's say that you grew up with this belief like, well, the religion that you're born into is the right religion and you should never explore beyond that religion. When you reach that point in your life where you get to the point of questioning and you start showing interest in maybe another religion or another idea, that boundary comes up. That programming comes up, whether it was instilled by you, whether it was instilled by a family member, whether it was instilled by generations. That boundary presents itself, and in that moment we have a choice. And that choice is, do I stay within the confines of that boundary because it's been there, it's been in place there for a reason, or do I cross it? Now, in a lot of instances, I think a lot of growth and expansion of an individual comes from crossing our own psychological barriers or our own barriers that have been instilled in us. And that's what allows us to expand beyond our own limiting beliefs or our own restrictions. Somebody who stays within that confines of that boundary, for example, would say, oh wait, I was told never to explore outside of my religion. So now you have just boxed yourself off. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. I think it's important that everybody's on their own page. And again, I'm just using religion as an example. Everybody's on their own page. Everybody is free to do as they want. But you are making a decision consciously to stay within the framework that has been built for you or that you have contributed to building. And that feels safe. And so you do that. But what happens when we cross over that boundary, even though it might be really scary initially, is we start to see things that we can never see from the other side of the fence. We start seeing different truths that are existing simultaneously to the truths that we've been holding on to. And that creates more questioning, and that creates a deeper thought process. Now, if we begin to follow these thoughts and give yourself time and space to follow your thoughts, you can really access new dimensions of reality or new ways of thinking that are outside of what you ever thought were imaginable. And what comes up for me, like what I think of, are great thinkers, like someone like Einstein. When I think of someone like Einstein or any type of prevalent figure who's pushed the world beyond its own understanding of self, what I imagine is that these people at some point or another explored thoughts beyond the limitations of their own mind. They took a thought and they ran with it, and they didn't stop. They said, you know what happens if I think about something this way? Okay, these are the current limitations. What happens if I think beyond those limitations? And what happens if I think beyond even those limitations? Discoveries in science, discoveries and breakthroughs and major shifts in society come about when we choose consciously to think beyond parameters, whether they're parameters that we've set for ourselves or society has set for ourselves. And that is what leads to expansion of self and expansion on a global level. And this is like the positive side of it, right? This is what leads to growth. Now, on the flip side, if you follow an unhealthy or a dark or a negative or a low vibrational thought, then I think that that's what leads to a lot of the crap that we're seeing today, which is disgusting human behavior, things that you can't even, that aren't even fathomable to you. You're just like, how can somebody ever think to do that to someone? The reason why we can't understand, let's say, the psychopath or the serial killer, and we're interested, right? Everyone's interested in true crime. Everyone's interested in figuring out what was the motive behind a person, because on their level, they don't understand it. And the reason that we don't understand it in a good way is because we haven't allowed ourselves to cross those boundaries of our own mind. And that's a result of having these ethical and moral boundaries, which do play a role in cultivating safety for the average person. So similarly, where you have an Einstein who follows a thought and jumps over whatever barriers or resistance comes up, if you choose to follow a negative thought, whatever it is, it could be something as simple as, I don't even want to go to those places. But, you know, something as simple and innocent, right? You see kids often, like in movies, or even maybe in our own upbringing, a kid might have, you know, what are those things called? A slingshot, right? And as a kid, sometimes you'll see kids like shooting birds with a slingshot, with no thought or remorse about hurting the animal. And at some point, there's a thought process or a barrier that says, like, we shouldn't do that, right? Or maybe, or, you know, unless it's like you're hunting it or whatever. There's something that will at some point bring about some empathy around that. And maybe you won't do it as you get older, but maybe you did it as a kid. But at some point, if that thought is left to explore further, like, you start building comfort around hurting an animal, that becomes normal. Then it becomes, another thought might follow of what you could further do to that animal to dominate power, which we even see in our society. And then further, right? And the more you allow that thought to travel, pushing the boundaries of acceptable behavior and pushing the boundaries of what might seem moral, the more and more you'll start finding the expansiveness of what that negative or uncomfortable thought can become. And people who go into those places follow thoughts, whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously, into darker and darker places, or places that seem unethical or immoral or just evil, eventually can push their minds to think and act in ways that for the average person is unimaginable. It's disgusting. It's like, how could you ever do that to an animal or a human or a child? Those behaviors are a result of somebody crossing the boundaries and limitations of their own mind, but in a different direction. So as beings, these boundaries and limitations of the mind exist within us at every given moment, and we buy into them. We choose what barriers we want to cross when we get up to them, and we choose which ones we don't want to cross. And this even happens with things as simple as identity. You know, we can get to a point where we feel really uncomfortable. I would never wear that. No, I would never wear that. Okay, so that becomes a hard no for you, but that hard no now just has to limit you from expanding or protects you. So I don't know, I just found this really interesting, and I just thought I would share. And I think the more we become mindful and start to observe what our own limitations are, start noticing where you stop yourself. Where do you start reaching your boundaries? Where do you start feeling these psychological fences in your own psyche when you're doing something and you're like, oh, I would never do that because of XYZ. I would never do that because my mom told me not to do that. Boom, you just caught it. There it is. Your mom told you this. Are you going to live your whole life scared to cross that because of what you were told? And if so, that's fine. But just become more mindful and more aware of what your boundaries are, and whether or not you've ever taken the time to question if it's actually a good or bad thing to cross it. Because I think that in order for us as individuals and as a society to expand ourselves and expand the consciousness of the planet, we have to be able to identify our limiting beliefs. And we have to be able to transform those limiting beliefs into something that serves us, so that we can open doors and open gateways and open portals and open dimensions to expand the collective and to push the world forward. Just don't follow those dark thoughts.